This is the Brazilian Slave Trade Project by Elizabeth Harris, Alexis Hilliard, and Destiny Hunt. The history of slavery in Brazil. Large scales of sugar plantations were actually started in Brazil, and Brazil ended up receiving 40% of these slaves, whereas the United States only got 5%. Around the 1500s, Portuguese was selling to the Orient but ended up in Brazil by accident. Portuguese people either forced the natives to go into slavery or even bribe them. Portuguese people treated the Brazilian people, or the Angola, as an infinite resource of slaves. By the 16th century, if one person had a lot of slaves, it demonstrated great wealth.
Alright. What were the commonest punishments in Brazil? Novian was a common punishment, and it was a Roman Catholic ritual that was used to cleanse a person. And a Novian was the whipping for 9 successive days, where the culprit was fastened to a cart and where he or she was received 200 to 300 lashes. And the slave owner thought that mangling the flesh of the slave and putting cayenne pepper and salt into the wounds would prevent gangrene and corruption. Thumbscrew was also a form of punishment that they did, and it's where they placed the slave's fingers into an instrument, and there was a handle on the top that would slowly be turned, and as it was turned, it would crush the slave's fingers. Iron was also another form of punishment for slaves, and they would use it for the slaves that tried to run away, and it was a big collar made out of iron, and it was placed on the slaves that were trying to run away but failed to run away. And the long spikes on the collar would prevent the slaves from being able to move in an area with trees and bushes. And it also made it to where the slaves could not lay down or lean against the surface, so it was used to punish them for more crimes other than just running away. If they stole something, then they would get the iron collar. And they also used the iron to make muzzles so the slave could not talk or eat, and then that was another form of punishment that they used as well. And whipping slaves was the most common form of punishment that everyone knows about today. And there was also another form of punishment where slaves were exposed at night and tied to a stake overnight, and they were tied over an ant's nest or sometimes a swarm of stinging mosquitoes. Alright, and the next question was, why did slave owners not want their slaves exposed to religion? And the slave owners did not want their slaves exposed to religion because they did not want their slaves to know of a higher power. Because if the slaves had a mind of their own and started to develop their own beliefs and faiths, then the slaves would figure out what they wanted in life and they would stop obeying the slave owners.
Okay, the first question is, are slaves helpless individuals? There had been some feast or merrymaking and unpermitted meetings where plans for deceiving the master are contrived and schemes are formed. No, I don't think they are helpless. They are subjugated and can't openly go against their masters, but they are still willing to make plans and deceive their masters and get away. The second question is, how was present-day Brazil compared to the feudal times in Europe? Neighboring Negroes have been invited and have crept in during the evening unperceived. It is on these occasions that plans for deceiving the master are contrived. Okay, for Europe, the great power of the planter not only over his slaves, but his authority over the free persons of lower rank, the respect which is required by these barons from free inhabitants of their land. In Brazil, the planters had to meet in secret with neighboring planters to plan on deceiving their masters. But if they were never given the opportunity to do anything, restraint creates the wish to act contrary to given rules. In Europe, if a person of color were not given the respect, then they would stand up for themselves. An example of this is when the author gave a story of a young man of color who was walking down the street when a man of importance approached him and then struck him with a long cane, saying, "Why don't you take off your hat when a white person appears?" The young man, being insulted, drew his knife and stabbed the white man, then ran off. The white man then died, saying that his murderer should not be punished, as It was his actions that got him killed. A few weeks later, the young man of color appeared, and the family of the man that was killed did nothing to the young man of color.
The picture that we elaborated on was the lesbian slave lashing. And as you can see in the picture, it was one slave lashing another slave, and the slave that's being punished was tied to a pole with a large amount of his body exposed. And in the background, you can see other slaves and the slave owners watching this poor man be punished for his behaviors. Beside the slave that's being punished, we can see other slaves lying on the ground that were also just punished. And then behind the guy that's doing the punishing is more whips, like he just got a whole day full of punishing people.
The second picture we looked at was the picture of the slavery pearl diving. The ship looks quite large, like it could have been transporting slaves, and the ship also looks broken and a bit destroyed. It has slaves jumping off the side of the boat with baskets in order to retrieve the pearls that had went overboard. Some of the slaves look like they're having a bit of trouble swimming due to the waves in the water. 500 years ago, the Portuguese imported sugar to Brazil, and with sugar also came slaves to work on the sugar plantations. Slaves were used because the Portuguese planters could easily and cheaply obtain African slaves. Since a large quantity of slaves were needed to work on the sugar plantations, it was the most logical reasoning. Between the years 1502 and 1867, almost 5 million people came to Brazil, which was 10 times more Africans than came to the United States in the entire history of slaves. The easy access and brutal working conditions created a more dramatic slave economy in Brazil than in the United States because Americans did not have easy access to slaves, and slaves were treated better in America as they were better housed, clothed, and better fed.
Slavery in Modern Brazil documentary. There was a part in the documentary where it talked about a capoeira school, and just the part dance, part martial arts. And since weapons were not allowed on the sugar plantations, the slaves had to find out a way to defend themselves. And so, if they were caught doing this kind of dance and martial arts, then they would be punished by their slave masters. And when the slaves were doing this dance, they had a lookout for it just in case their slave owners tried to come and catch them. And when they weren't looking, they were doing the martial arts part of the dance. But if the slave owners were looking, then they were doing the dance instead of doing the fighting part. That's all, folks!